Well, I mean, when it comes to an individual's perception of something that happened or an individual's experience, if they believe something, I mean, you can't deny that, but you can't say that there's extraterrestrials. There's no evidence, right? We have zero evidence that there's any sort of life from outside the Earth.
Yes and no. It's interesting because you see these positions, like there's no evidence and there's a lot of evidence, right? And you have this back and forth. There is a lot of evidence. Is there a lot of scientific evidence? No, scientific evidence is a higher bar. And yes, like there's still things need to be done to meet that standard. If we talk about legal evidence, there's plenty of evidence that would satisfy definitions of evidence in a legal court of law, right? And
Can you give an example?
Well, like witness testimony. So in a scientific context, it doesn't hold a lot of water. In a legal context, it can hold a lot of water. And so you can convict someone, without a weapon, without the murder weapon, based on witness testimony and circumstantial evidence and a lot of other things, right? If you took the case of are there ETs, flesh and blood ETs, to the court, presented all the evidence, you should win. There's enough evidence to get an affirmative conviction that that's the case. If you take it to a scientific lab, you're going to have a hard time, meeting the standards of scientific veracity. So part of what's going on is we have different views of what counts as real and what counts as evidence.
Well, for evidence, if you want to prove something exists, you have to have some sort of physical evidence of it.
Right. There's a lot of physical evidence with a phenomenon, right? So like you take abductees, people who have experiences of being abducted, and so there's no smoking gun. So I think this is part of your point. You're pointing out there's no smoking gun. I'm saying you're right. There isn't a smoking gun. We don't have that yet, unless Gary Nolan and his team are able to get the government to roll out one of the crafts that we have and hangar X, Y, and Z. So we're waiting for the smoking gun, but we don't need the smoking gun to be able to look at all the other evidence and use scientific methodologies and logical methods of deduction and induction to arrive at a very probable conclusion based on that evidence, just as like we would in a court of law, right? So there's archaeological evidence, there's sociological evidence, there's lots of experiencer reports, there is physical evidence, like the burns in the grass that Chris Bledsoe showed, right? Even Travis Walton, when they went and they studied the tree growth of the rings where that incident occurred, and there was an anomaly with how the trees that were closer to where the event occurred grew in a different rate than the other trees farther out. So
because of radiation, right?
That's the assumption. There have been implants, there's scars, there's body marks, there's scratches on cars, there's a lot of physical evidence, but it's not a smoking gun. But we should be careful not to dismiss all that physical evidence just because it's not a smoking gun. But when you combine it with all the other elements, it's very suggestive, right? Very, very suggestive. Part of my study of this phenomena using my integral approach is I've identified, over 35 different theories about who are they and what are they, right? There's the time traveler hypothesis, the crypto-terrestrial, the ultra-terrestrial, the extraterrestrial, the, sociological hypothesis, there's all these different theories people have. When I map those out and I look at what are the different variables that they're highlighting, where are they from, what's their kind of consciousness they have, what kind of bodies do they have, what's their intention, when I look at 8 different variables about what's being described, and I look at the 3 or 4 possibilities of they're on this planet currently, or they're from other planets, or they're interdimensional. When I kind of map out all the variables, there's 25 variables. And what's interesting is these theories, these 35 different theories that have emerged over the last 2 decades, essentially, when you add them all together, they're accounting for these 25 different possibilities. So in other words, what seems to be happening is every conceivable combination of who they are is represented in kind of this growing list of who they might be. And it seems that actually all of them are potentially true in some sense, or at least a majority of them are true.
Interesting.
You know, so that there are ultra-terrestrials, there are crypto-terrestrials, there are extraterrestrials, there are interdimensionals. Like all of this seems to be happening, right? And it's kind of this Pandora's box. And this is partly why some people have certain experiences with some of those, and other people have other experiences with, you know, different sets, right? And then you kind of end up arguing, well, who's right? Well, actually, I think the cosmos is so diverse and creative. There's a good chance we're likely interacting with all of those different possibilities.
So out of all of the different hypotheses or all the different examples of what these different intelligences could be, was there any sort of underlying consistency between all of them, or any kind of like common denominator across all of them? How many of them did you say there were? Like 40?
There's like 35 different theories that they are all over the board. You know, like some it's like ancient aliens, or some it's, you know, it's us from the future, right? Or
Right.
It's like some it's like they're from other star systems. No, they're from other dimensions. Like, oh, you know, they're, you know, so there's a lot of variety. You know, but it's interesting that kind of in the course of human imagination, we've come up with all the possibilities, all the combinations are represented in that list of 37, right? So you have an approach like SETI that says, you know, like, you know, there are probably, you know, life on other planets, but it's very far away, and we're looking for radio signals, and, you know, we're trying to, like, you know, kind of tune in to their channel, and they're not coming up with, there's like nothing has come out of the SETI project basically over the last, you know, 40 plus years with a lot of funding, right? And so it's interesting. You compare that with like kind of ufology, which has a lot of craziness in it, but when you pull away a lot of that craziness, there's a lot of evidence, right? You know, like you line up, you get a lot of Chris Bledsoes in the room, you know, and it's like, or you go and hang out with them, you know, and you have multi-witness reports, you have lots of multi-witness reports, you know, and so there is quite a case to be made, and again, I think for me, it often comes back down to, you know, different perceptions based on different subtle bodies, based on different subtle senses associated with those bodies. And because we are still tend to privilege our five senses in our physical body, and we want physical evidence that matches our, you know, vision and our hearing, that we tend to have a very narrow view of what is evidence, right? And so what does a broader but still very scientific and rigorous view of evidence look like that's able to include and compare experiencer reports, able to understand how the brain works in relationship to this phenomena, right? So like, you know, like Gary's research on the basal ganglia, and, you know, how there seems to be this hyperconnectivity, right? So one could look at that to say, well, okay, there's this hyperconnectivity, so people are just better at projecting or imagining these phenomena. Or you could say, no, that's an antenna that actually allows them to perceive the phenomena. So kind of the same data point could be used to argue for or against the phenomenon, right? You know, and so, but then when you couple it with like a lot of this other kind of evidence, then, you know, and this is why I feel like the government knows a lot more, at least sections of the government know a lot more than what they're letting on, is because, you know, like I was told by a CIA agent that they actually have a test to determine if you have alien DNA in your system, right? And so maybe not, I don't know. But this person's a trustworthy person. I don't have any reason to believe that they're pulling one over on me. But it's like there's those kinds of things that get said by certain people who seem to have knowledge about these things that just kind of boggle your mind. You know, like Chris, you know, shared several of these kind of things in his interview with you, where you just end up scratching your head. You're like, and there's nothing you can do with it. It's like, well, until they show me the DNA test, you know, like I can't believe it.
Did he give you any more details on that? Like, how do they get the test, and what do they test for?
No. But, you know, there's, you know, but so I think the whole idea of like evidence, like we need to like zoom out a little bit and go, hey, well, what do we mean by evidence? What kinds of evidence would count, and what combination of evidences would be suggestive? Because I think the conversation too often is framed around the smoking gun, And then that's used to dismiss a lot of otherwise important points and insights.